you. Good evening, everyone. If you could all take your seats, we're going to get started in just a minute. Don't be shy. There's lots of room over here on the sides as well. File on in. All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Rachel Evestein, and I work at Solar One. Welcome to Clean Energy Connections, a creation of Solar One and Acre in partnership with Green Tech Media. This is the final event of our 2015 series, which is based around the REV, or Reforming Energy Vision, working groups. It also happens to be the 25th Clean Energy Connections event ever. So that's, yes. So we're so proud of how far we've come with this event, and we look forward to many more. Big thanks to Sarah Jayanthi and Micah Koch for creating this event during their respective tenures at Solar One and Acre. Tonight we will be discussing the ultimate resiliency plan, microgrids, and the continued segmentation of electric grid assets. And just for a little bit of background, at Solar One, I'm the Downstate Program Manager for NYSERDA's EDGE program, where I manage outreach for NYSERDA's programs in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester. This event has been a cornerstone of our outreach to the clean tech community, which is all of you. And before we kick off the event, I want to get a show of hands. How many people are attending Clean EC for the first time? Wow, okay, a lot of first timers. Welcome again. So reminder, Green Tech Media is live streaming this event. So if you need to get up, please avoid the cameras, and note that the bar is closed during this event, sorry. And will reopen after the event for networking. So please be careful with your bottles. Anytime anything falls on the floor, everybody at home and here will hear it. Yes. On cue. And of course, cell phones on mute. In-person audience members, this is an interactive discussion, so if you want to ask the panel questions, you can do one of the following. If you're here in the studio, you can write your questions on index cards. There will be people kind of walking up and down the aisles to collect those cards, and we'll do questions kind of towards the end. And then hello and welcome to those of you joining us on live stream from across America and maybe even the world. You guys, and anyone here actually, can join the discussion by tweeting at the handle @CleanECNYC with the hashtag clean and then NRGX. And like I said, in-person audience members can also tweet questions. Shout out to our sponsors and partners, NYSERDA, NYC EDC, partners Internol and YPE. And before the panel gets up here, I would like to introduce Micah Koch to give some opening remarks and frame the discussion in the context of REV and the Clean Energy Fund. In addition to being a Clean EC founder, Micah is director of New York Prize, NYSERDA's community microgrid competition. So thank you and enjoy the show.
All right, how you guys doing? I'm gonna need a little bit more energy than that, New York. How are you guys doing? All right, thank you. All right, so welcome everyone to Clean Energy Connections. Rachel said this is our 25th event, and we've been doing this event since 2010. And so as we mark this occasion, I just want to point out that we're really forging ahead, I think, into some uncharted territory. This event marks a really unique point in time, and I would be remiss personally if I didn't thank all of our sponsors, the speakers that we've had over the last 25 events, including tonight, the regular attendees, and we have a couple of regulars here, as well as the crew here at WNYC who've really supported this journey over the last 5 years. So please join me in thanking all of them. All right. So tonight we're going to dive deep into microgrids, which is an area of the grid edge where I think New York Prize, which is the program that I run at NYSERDA, is really pushing the envelope and bringing together communities, utilities, and third parties in challenging but really necessary conversations on how to build the 21st century energy infrastructure that we desperately need. There's a new era of partnerships underway that I think is ushered in by the reality that the current utility model is just not sustainable. It's also a fact of changing customer expectations and technologies that have evolved to enable greater choice and control, as well as the fact that extreme weather events, I think, are now the new normal. So in this context, New York Prize is not only a design competition, it's not only a mechanism to assess the feasibility of community-scale microgrids, but it's really also a forcing function that's addressing the value of DER and grid benefits, community resilience, and it's really also, I think, a way to ground the conversation around the distribution of costs and benefits in very real-world applications. That's what we're after. So as many of you know, Governor Cuomo's Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV, is designed to create a more dynamic, resilient, clean, valuable, as well as affordable energy system for all New Yorkers. To achieve these ends, the state is evolving from a mandate and monopoly-driven approach to a more competitive market-based system. By introducing more competitive market incentives, New York seeks to unlock innovative solutions and business models and attract more private capital that's necessary to modernize our energy system. REV's initial focus is on the electric utility sector, which really is an industry that's remained largely unchanged since the age of Thomas Edison. I've heard utility folks talk about lines in service today that were actually installed by Thomas Edison. For the past century, utilities have sold and delivered electricity to customers in one-way relationships and through centralized command and control infrastructure. The strong central grid and the power plant backbone that we have is absolutely vital, but it needs to be modernized. REV really seeks to create the conditions for the grid to become a modern, dynamic platform that hosts a wide range of solutions and better supports the technologies, trends, and needs of the 21st century. In the past, utilities have viewed third-party technology providers as competitors at best. Through REV, utilities and third parties are forming innovative partnerships to deliver business models that benefit not only utilities and not only third parties, but most importantly, the customer. With this in mind, REV has and will continue to make available a number of open-sourced opportunities for third parties, innovators, founders to develop new solutions and implement them in New York. New York Prize is really helping to lead this effort, allowing communities to reduce costs, understand where opportunities for economic development and jobs exist, and promote clean energy and resiliency for critical infrastructure. Our mission at Prize is to enable the technological, the operational, and the business models, most importantly, that will help communities to reduce costs, promote clean energy, and build reliability and resiliency into the grid. Today, Prize is really informing the REV process, ultimately serving as a demonstration of the benefits of microgrids, and specifically community microgrids across New York State. Over the coming years, these systems will test new services and business models and provide utilities with experience managing the grid with distributed resources such as solar, CHP, things like energy storage, demand response, as well as energy efficiency, which should really come first in any good microgrid project. Prize projects will show how new technologies and new models can unlock new value streams in the grid. And tonight, I'm really excited because we're going to hear about how this is happening, mostly in the context of single customer campus-style microgrids, which I think will continue to proliferate, particularly at universities and places like military bases. But also, these are very different from the community-scale projects that we're seeding with New York Prize. Microgrids are really designed to meet the goals of REV. They deliver the most control and optimization that you're going to get from any distributed energy resource. They seamlessly integrate renewables, they improve resiliency, they optimize capital and energy efficiency, and they create savings for the customer. But I think most importantly, they're designed to meet the specific needs of the community where they're being built. So in partnership with New York's utilities, we developed this New York Prize map of opportunity zones that highlight areas across the state where the local utility expects the distribution system could benefit from a microgrid. We didn't require proposed microgrids to be within an opportunity zone for stage 1 of our feasibility studies, but all awardees were required to have the support and participation of the local utility. That was absolutely critical. And as it turns out, the majority of prize projects actually do fall within these zones, and about half of our projects are in communities with low to moderate average incomes as defined by HUD. The economic viability, I think, of a microgrid will depend on more than its location relative to these opportunity zones. A lot of this is going to depend on the mix of customers, their load patterns, types of distributed energy resources that they provide. So today, with PRIZE, there are 83 feasibility studies that are currently underway in really every corner of the state. Those should be complete by early 2016. Business and planning designs will be available by December of 2017. So the stage 2, and we expect build-out to start in 2018 for the projects that get down-selected. We're hoping that these first round of projects will yield really unique insights into different ownership structures, different engineering schemes, but probably most importantly will lead to scale across the state. The technology configurations that we'll see may be unique, but the business model innovations, I think, will have to be replicable. Last thing I want to say here is that REV, I think, fundamentally recognizes that New York State's electricity grid contains a diverse set of value streams related to data, customer satisfaction, things like reliability and resilience, convenience, ancillary services, amongst many others. Some of these societal benefits are really not valued by the market today, but may be in the future. And that's why it's vital that New York Prize projects show how new technologies and business models can capitalize on these various value streams, and then how these benefits get distributed between the utility, the third party, and the customer. All these elements will need to feed into a benefit cost analysis tool, which we've developed and which is now publicly available on the Prize site, which is prize.ny.gov. I think it's a great tool for anyone considering a community-scale microgrid, particularly in New York. So the transformation that's underway requires not only the support of regulators and not only utilities, but also technology developers, engineers, and citizens. I don't think we'll succeed in this without a small army of well-informed local leaders, the people who are to your left, the people who are to your right, and the folks behind you and in front of you, who can really push forward at the community level and engage their networks in this effort. Your presence here tonight and your engagement over the past 24 events for Clean Energy Connections, because you're now part of the Clean Energy Connections family, I think is really testament to the progress that we've made, and it's certainly a reason for our optimism for future progress. So with that, and before Omar takes the stage, I just wanted to play a quick video for one of the Prize projects that's as local as we can get to this location tonight. It's a project in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and we'll now play the video. Thanks.
We're in Red Hook in South Brooklyn. Been out here for 60 years, on and off.
We had that Sandy. I've never seen nothing like that in my life.
We lost electricity. We had no running hot water or anything like that.
It's 11,000 people in Red Hook. How do you prepare 11,000 people for the next tragedy? So I come to a lot of these meetings to bring back the information to the community.
In the recent slew of disasters we've gone through, power has obviously been a really big problem. All of our community was impacted. We found that a community microgrid within the larger Con Edison grid may be able to provide some of the solutions in order to create a more resilient, more sustainable, and a better power system. The idea behind the Red Hook community microgrid is that it will be decentralized generation. So these either solar or wind or maybe gas combined heat and power systems focused on public buildings and buildings that will provide emergency services when the rest of the grid goes down.
We've learned something from Irene and Sandy. You know, we're all in the same boat. It's about people, working with people. So it's neighbors helping neighbors.
When the New York Prize came out, we saw it would be a really good way to expand the idea of energy independence to the larger Red Hook community. This is all part of a bigger picture, which is something called REV, which is Reforming the Energy Vision.
After Hurricane Sandy, Governor Cuomo initiated REV to rethink the regulations and policy to build a more resilient, affordable, and clean energy system.
NY Prize is a competitive program for building community microgrids. We were one of the winners, but I believe there's 80 plus around the state that also won. And so we're going to compete with them for the next round of funding on design.
New York Prize really is about catalyzing projects. If we can find replicable and scalable models, then those projects can ultimately have real commercial and financial viability.
We're assessing the feasibility of what a microgrid would look like for Red Hook. Here on the solar panels, tell me what the rated power of one of the panels are.
250?
250 watts, right?
We felt that incorporating workforce development as part of our proposal was super important. Green City Force, they already have an energy efficiency auditing team that we felt like we could tie into.
There's a real opportunity here for low and moderate income communities to be able to take advantage of new technology solutions, and there's a path to economic development in the communities that need it the most.
If we can connect the farm to the microgrid, that system can make sure that critical services are available to people in an emergency.
One day, everywhere you go, every community will have like community microgrids. You can start with Red Hook.
If we don't take advantage of this as a community, it's going to be all for naught. This is a great country, and now we got to hold this country to be even greater.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Omar Sadeh. I'm a senior analyst at GTM Research, the market analysis group of Green Tech Media. Thank you. And I've really investigated a lot of these things in terms of microgrids and spent quite a lot of time looking into them. Over the course of, I'd say, the past several years, I've talked to many of you all in the audience, as well as some of your colleagues, and we talked a lot about the microgrids in terms of the technology development, in terms of strategy, in terms of some of the project specifics, how you finance these things. And I come from a pretty technical background, and what I found is that contrary to some of the IEEE definitions or some of the definitions in sort of the academic space, the market today is really moving towards, I mean, we say it's a microgrid and it's a loosened definition of what maybe we find in, again, those IEEE definitions. So before I jump into what a microgrid is by definition, I wanted to pull up a few relatable technologies that tend to be in the same conversation. These things might be familiar to a lot of you all. The notion of a virtual power plant aggregating distributed resources, behind the meter DERs, backup gensets, uninterruptible power sources, and then this whole notion of a utility operated DERMS system. So microgrids is this nebulous topic where it's very customizable. At the same time, it tends to be deployed on a very project-to-project basis. However, today it's picked up a lot more attention. And it fits really squarely in the middle over here, but does depend highly on several aspects. And we'll be diving into those in the panel. Those include ownership structures, objectives, business plans, and obviously local regulatory landscape, which differs quite substantially state by state. So to really set the tone, I wanted to read our GTM Research definition of a microgrid, which is an independently operable part of the distribution network, including distributed energy sources, loads, network assets, that is controlled within clearly defined geographical boundaries and can operate in grid-connected and islanded mode. Now, that might go contrary to what I just said, how these things are extremely customizable and tend to be different on a case-by-case basis. So I wanted to highlight a few topics over here that are prevalent in many of the projects that we look into. One is coordinated DER control, 2, heat and/or electricity co-optimization, islanding capabilities, and the close proximity of generation and load. Now, if some of you all probably engage quite often with analysts, you probably have heard the saying that we're at this tipping point in any industry that you talk to the analyst about. But on it, well, you truly are, and we've been moving from really this from technology development, and we are at this pivot point right now where community scale microgrids, where places like New York are really moving to commercialize these technologies and are deploying them at a pretty massive scale. They might be feasibility studies right now, but if you see states like California and other states are really deploying these, as well as some in New York and elsewhere, and we'll be touching on those in a bit, we are at this pivotal point right now where technology vendors, regulators, regulators as well, but deregulated and regulated utilities, engineering firms, the financial community is really coming together with a lot of interest in these projects. So who deploys microgrids? The specific use cases differ quite substantially across the board, depending on who the end user is, and that might be quite obvious. Some from military energy resiliency to C&I cost energy reduction to even critical infrastructure support in communities. Behind me is a map how we see end users and their implementation drivers and why they deploy these microgrids. And again, it differs quite substantially, but the underlying fact is that often they're deployed for cost reduction and reliability purposes. You'll notice that utility is not up here. And specifically today, utilities are becoming increasingly interested in these technologies, from Con Edison to Duke Energy to the IOUs in California. Right now, many of them, at least the deployed ones, are in the R&D stage. But as we hear about places like Illinois, where they're proposing 6 massive scale projects to the tune of, I think, up to $300 million, utilities are really taking this seriously. And the panel is going to touch a lot on those different, I would say, the interaction, the relationships between the two multiple stakeholders, including the utilities. And drivers can be something we can talk about for quite a long time, and I've had many of those discussions. But what this panel is going to focus on is how we get beyond some of the barriers. Things like utility franchise rights, the lack of microgrid financing models, the lack of performance metrics, and some of the unresolved issues around distribution network cost. Furthermore, you heard Micah talk about single entity microgrids focused on one building. However, when we move beyond that, and that's something we foresee in the future, and I'll touch on that in our forecast section, but did you know that a microgrid, a microgrid that sells power to different customers and that crosses essentially a public streetway can be treated as an electric corporation? That means it will be regulated by the Public Service Commission, which essentially puts on a huge burden on the end user, which today, again, a lot of those rules haven't come to fruition, aren't certain, and differ a lot state by state. So at GTM Research, we recorded 216 microgrids in the US. That's 92 operational, that's 124 operational, 92 planned and under development. Why I know those numbers really well is because I talked to most of those developers myself. And what we see over here is a time series analysis on the left, on the right, where we recorded projects by number of projects developed annually by year. And you see a good trend over here, starting really this healthy market growth of microgrids being developed. 2013 would be the caveat over here, where if you guys are aware of the ARA funding projects, that's when a lot of those microgrid projects for smart grid development really came to light. But overall, there's healthy growth in the market, at least from what the market defines as a microgrid. On the donut shape over here is where we took an cumulative look at the market, starting from some of the projects deployed in the early 2000s all the way up to July 2015 when this report was published. And we found that, interestingly, most microgrids are in fact sub 1 megawatt or 1 megawatt or lower. That's kind of interesting for a second, because when we think about microgrids, we think about the large-scale things that are being deployed and get a lot of publicity in the news. However, if we look at the market as a whole, specifically by number of projects deployed rather than capacity, we find that the majority of microgrids are in fact pretty small, which falls in line with this whole notion of critical infrastructure and how we support maybe a trauma unit out of a hospital versus the entire hospital. And with technology costs being quite high in the past, it does make sense that in the short term, that could continue, and things that we foresee that at least in the next couple of years that critical infrastructure will be one of the main drivers to deploying microgrids specifically here in New York. However, if we look forward to the next 3 to 5 years, we do expect some of those to become a bit more complicated, driven by a number of factors, including C&I business continuity, really aimed at industrial processes and how some of those large-scale industries could stay up to date in the event of a power outage or grid event. Others could be utility modernization techniques, wholesale market participation opportunities. We're talking about the ongoing REV initiative here in New York, but also several other things in California, like the DERP proposal that's really talking about this whole notion of aggregating resources and bidding into the wholesale market. And then in ERCOT, but that's a bit, though it's a bit in early stages, the ISO proposed 3 different market options, and I'm not making this stuff up. Their group is called DREAM Working Group, stands for Distributed Resource Energy and Ancillary Service Market, I believe. So we've come to a point where acronyms are becoming interesting to our market. One more thing I wanted to touch on is the vendor community. Now, I myself have talked to many of these vendors, but often the microgrid control and energy management subcomponent of the vendor taxonomy attracts a lot of people, from homegrown microgrid-specific companies to even grid providers from very of the known entities, including Siemens, ABB, et cetera. Defense has always been a big industry where, whether it be on-site energy consumption at the U.S. military bases in the U.S., which are a major consumer of energy, but also abroad, how we look at energy security and like forward operating bases. That's been a big component of microgrid development. And then we've got building energy management from Honeywell to Veridity Energy here in New York and Blue Pillar, as well, and other companies that are on the generator side that are really building software solutions forward from the generator. So, what does the microgrid landscape look like today? This is how, the 124 projects I talked about, we've put them on a map over here, and you can see that there's significant bundles of areas where microgrids have really proliferated. California is one. They've got a great regulatory and a great statewide initiative there to promote it through their EPIC program. Northeast is focused a lot on university and R&D projects. And then there's places where there are a lot of remote communities, such as Alaska, that have really moved towards integrating either fast ramping diesel gensets or even today battery storage with renewables. Again, driven by high energy costs, the lack, and in order to avoid utility transmission upgrades. And I think we lost the PowerPoint. All right, well, I was going to show you a little statewide comparison, but essentially New York is one of the leading states today. They've got about 220 megawatts compared to everyone else. California has the most number of microgrids deployed. But I wanted to point out one interesting state over here, Georgia. You can see it's second in terms of aggregate generation capacity, but they've only got 1 microgrid. It's a 160 megawatt fossil fuel driven microgrid at a military base. And when you talk about the diversity in microgrids, this is a great example. 1 microgrid that promotes the state as the second highest. Also, what's interesting about this microgrid is, while here there's been a lot of regulatory work with utilities in terms of who can own distributed generation and who can own energy storage, in Georgia, the utility actually operates the generation when it's in grid-connected mode, and in islanded, it's strictly for the military base. But again, this really feeds on the notion that every state has its own regulatory body, and every state's a bit different, so understanding all those different environments is really important to developers. Energy storage is a hot topic, a lot of discussion going on today. If we look at energy storage in terms of microgrids, there's in fact, it's pretty focused on 5 main states: California with its SGIP program, EPI and EPIC programs, but as well as Alaska, Vermont, Oregon, and Texas, really making up the bulk of energy storage in microgrids. I don't know if that's my fault or not, but lastly, I wanted to wrap this up with our forecast and to really put things in context. Today, by the end of 2015, we expect to be at about 1.3 gigawatts of microgrid capacity in the US. What's striking is that fossil fuel generation actually makes up an enormous component of this. 90%, according to some of the data we've been collecting, while renewables only make up 6%, and that's aggregate capacity. We're not talking about which has renewables or not. But when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, since historically a lot of these projects have been resiliency oriented, and when you have 30 megawatts of CHP deployed at a hospital and 200 kilowatts of solar panels. In general, microgrids are viewed as an integration platform for renewables. However, in the past, most of the capacity has actually been fossil fuel driven. Moving forward, we do expect a lot of interest in the market to deploy these things, not only driven from utilities, but also from the vendor community to deploy these things at end users like hospitals, military bases, and the various other people that could deploy this. We think, at least through our estimates and our base case forecast, we projected the capacity to increase by about 130%, largely driven by renewables. Again, there's going to be a significant component added in here by renewables, solar in the mainland, California and Hawaii, and a lot of wind in places like Alaska. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to introduce the panel over here. If the panelists could come out on stage, we'll kick off the rest of this event. Good afternoon. So I'm still here, and we're lucky to have four really distinguished people in the microgrid space here that know the space extremely well, have been involved in projects, have actually operate projects, and we're going to share some interesting insights today. We've got Bradley Kranz, the Vice President of Business Development at NRG Energy, and this is from my left. Paul Belnick, the Vice President of the Integrated Grid at NYPA. Brett Hollenbach, the founder and CEO of Timberrock Energy Solutions. And lastly but not least, John Bradley, the Associate Vice President for Sustainability, Energy, and Technical Service at NYU. So I wanted to kick things off from a very high level. Paul, in NYPA's strategic vision in 2014 to 2016, it calls microgrids and distributed generation the hallmark of new power systems. Your CEO has also claimed NYPA is going to be one of the most innovative and advanced utilities in the U.S. in a very short period, with a lot of infrastructure spending. I think I've seen the number up to $3 to $4 billion in the next decade. What do microgrids mean to an entity like NYPA?
Okay, well, excuse me. Well, microgrids is the future. I think, as we all know, since the 1800s, the utility system has been large generation, transmission, distribution, customer. And all the electrons were coming towards the customer, and that was the economic model. Well, you know, we're in the 21st century, so now we all have cell phones on our side. We have lower cost PV, we have fuel cells, we have lower cost storage. And now the electrons are beginning to be placed at the user, and the electrons are coming back onto the grid. So when you look at that, what happens is it's a change in dynamic, it's a change in market. And when you have a change in market, you have a paradigm shift, and that's where we are now. And particularly in New York, we're beginning that with the REV process and rolling that out. We're in the first chapter of cataloging what we have relative to the electric delivery system. Each of the utilities are looking at that. And we're also looking at where this system is weak. And rather than spend the estimated tens of billions of dollars in putting capital in the ground to build that system, correct those weaknesses, the alternative is to look at cost-effective generation at the customer side that can be controlled by both the customer and the utility at a much lower cost than doing all those upgrades.
I think you bring up a couple good points, especially as a lot of these are being investigated in the REV process, in the feasibility stage at least. You know, NYPA isn't a New York investor-owned utility, nor is it the typical IPP that you see, such as NRG. And often as a generation and transmission company, that connection with the end user is typically through a distributor. How does, to develop these projects, and you guys have several projects to date that you've been working on, what's the missing link there? Is there a missing link, and how do you get a microgrid with the end user? How do you connect to the end user if you don't own distribution lines?
Okay. So NYPA has, over the last 20 years, operated turnkey energy efficiency programs where we audit, design, construct, and finance projects. And we do that across the entire public portfolio. So, and we are really agnostic as to where these entities get their power from, what utility they get it from. So, for instance, State University of Albany, a multiple user of our program. We have a very close relationship with them at the facility level, as John is in NYU facility, where we've done first the lighting, then we did the motors, then we did the drives, then we did the control systems. Each of these are different phases. Now that renewables are coming to market parity, we're beginning to move that out across. So we've done that at SUNY, we've done that with corrections, we've done it at school districts across the state. We're doing PV on school buildings statewide. So we have a very close relationship, particularly with the public sector, because that's where our space is. Now what's happening is with the reduction in cost of the generation on the customer side. So for instance, now we're putting in cogeneration plants. We just finished one at Rikers Island. We're looking at one up at Empire State Plaza, the seat of government. We're looking at a number of projects with SUNY and CUNY, where we're doing some of the things that Trent's doing here, where we're integrating PV, generation, battery storage, and also working arm in arm with Central Hudson in the case of New Paltz, and down here in Queens with Con Ed, to test the idea of utility control of these devices so that they don't only operate at the peak of the customer, but also during time of system stress at those utilities. And that's kind of where REV is going, to have these resources available to move in and out of the market in a cost-effective way.
And you guys act as, and I'll get to everyone else in a moment. I just wanted to
I was
elaborate a bit on
wonder
this.
that.
When you guys do develop these, you guys, what position do you take? Are you the developer, and then are you able to own and operate the generation? I know if Con Ed is in charge of one of these projects, they can't own generation. How does NYPA fit into the equation?
Okay. NYPA is integrated to the utility to the extent that we were born in 1930, initially to build the FDR hydroelectric plant along the St. Lawrence Seaway. Now we operate the Niagara Falls, and at that time there was a question, public or private. New York said these should be publicly owned assets, and that's how the Power Authority was born. So we have that, and then we have the transmission lines that come down.
Okay, we'll jump into the whole story about regulatory affairs and that interesting relationship with the utility. But Bradley from NRG, I mean, you guys you operate across the entire nation, and you guys have projects, specifically microgrid development projects in the States as well as in Necker Island with Richard Branson. Tell us about, we've got New York Prize over here. We've got a lot of different projects and various state-driven initiatives. How does the market here compare to other places, and where do you see where do you see development happening in terms of the microgrid community?
Well, thank you. I think New York is certainly at the forefront of developing the opportunities for microgrids. The New York Prize and the REV initiative is something that NRG has been extremely involved in. We're involved in 4 New York Prize projects. And quite frankly, the idea of a microgrid, a campus-style microgrid for a single customer, we've been doing those for years, and we have a number of projects that we've done. One of our most recent being in New Jersey with Princeton Hospital, and there we have a microgrid that consists of a combined heat and power system, integrates with solar, thermal storage, and backup power as well. And really, there you have a customer whose priority is, first and foremost, economic, power, but, also reliability, and to know that there will be no interruption in their ability to serve customers and preserve the life and safety of patients at the hospital. That's really, expanding from there. I think the opportunity that New York is creating is to go beyond a single customer microgrid and look to bring together a group of, geographically co-located customers, but use, really make the sum of the parts larger, and that, there may be an anchor tenant with a hospital that for them the CHP is the right choice, but across the street there's another business that happens to have a lot of rooftop and we can put solar there. Well, if we can get past the some of the regulatory barriers that exist today with, serving customers across public rights of way, we can make a lot more microgrid projects viable, because you've got multiple customers, multiple benefits, and the opportunity to integrate, a more diverse array of distributed energy resources.
Speaking of that, of having the notion where you have, one building act as a microgrid, but beyond that, when you integrate a number of buildings, I know, Brett, you guys are doing some very interesting work. Brent, excuse me, are doing some very interesting work in Maryland in terms of not only having single site microgrids, but also having several microgrids at multiple customer locations aggregated through some sort of virtual power plant. Could you talk to us a bit about, what you guys are doing at Timber Rock, what it means to have a technology solution at multiple sites, and then what is that a microgrid?
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time trying to, I guess I'll call it demystify microgrids. Microgrids are technically complex, right? But at the end of the day, we like to tell people, you have a building, your energy cost should be lower, you should have greater resiliency, you should have greater sustainability. And we really try to distill it down to that as the value proposition. And then there's lots of stuff we do behind the scenes you don't need to worry about that make all that work. But fundamentally, we talk about that as a value proposition. The reason I make that case is you can explain that to a customer for a campus, or you can explain that to a customer who might own just a single building. One of the advantages of thinking about microgrids at the building scale, a single building, is that it does sort of do an end run around some of the stickier wickets related to microgrids and wheeling power across power lines. In most jurisdictions, the incumbent existing electrical distribution utility has franchise rights to do that. So if you start trying to move energy from here across the street over there, it gets more complex from a regulatory point of view. So one of the areas we focused as, instead of thinking about, well, let's wait for the regulatory environment to change, for those rules to change, rather we said, well, how can we deliver that value proposition, lower cost, resiliency, sustainability? How can we do that at a single building, behind it, effectively, if you think behind a single meter, how can we do that, but then aggregate up these buildings such that virtually they're aggregated so that you can dispatch the capacity you might have in that building in some pretty smart ways. So
what happens behind those closed doors when you get in and you talk to utilities? They don't want you selling power to some of their customers or across public streets. How do you navigate the relationship between a utility as this virtual power plant concept when you're selling power to different customers? What goes on essentially? Like, I know it's a topic that comes up a lot and is one of the major barriers to deploying microgrids, but how do you address that?
Yeah. So the honest answer is we play within the rules that exist and we don't cross those lines. So
are there rules, or is it more like you guys are discussing this and it's still not permanent regulatory-wise?
Well, there are clearly rules. There are things that you can do that would transgress on those franchise rights, and other things you can do that don't transgress on those franchise rights of the electrical distribution utility. One thing I think might be worth pointing out is we all think about the utilities that deliver our power to us, but usually these utilities are operating under a system operator or a grid operator, which has a whole different market opportunity to deliver services back. So, for example, one of the things we do at our microgrids is we provide frequency regulation back to the system operator. So not something that the distribution utility needs, but something the ISO or system operator needs. We do that, we can provide that service back to the ISO or system operator without stepping on the rights and obligations of the distribution utility. So it's a way of basically understanding how the grid works, creating as much value to the host site, the distribution, the ISO, and playing in bounds of the distribution utility. Because one important thing from our point of view, a lot of people think about microgrids as an opportunity to kind of cut that cord. How can we really disintermediate ourselves or separate ourselves from the distribution utility in some way, or at least sometimes? The reality is large-scale wind, large-scale solar is going to be the most cost-effective way of generating kilowatt hour on our grid. We need the distribution utilities. We need them doing their job. We need them to have a viable path for delivering that energy across. They're critical to this. So what we try to focus in on is how can we look at the total value creation opportunity, deliver value without stepping on anybody else's toes, and make the system stronger overall. So if anybody tells you they've got it all figured out, they're lying.
Many people have told me that.
It's not true. Don't believe it. Don't buy what they're selling. It's not true. All of us in this space are one at a time going off, and in each jurisdiction it's slightly different, but we're trying to find opportunities to create the value for that host site, deliver value back to the grid, and play as nicely as possible, and try to demonstrate that for the distribution utility that we can actually add value back to them. So we're spending a lot of time, and I'll take a breather and pass the mic here.
We're going to get into the subject because I think this is where the meat lies and the next step in microgrid development. But John, I apologize we haven't gotten to you. As one of the operators of a microgrid today at NYU, you guys have had a microgrid for the past 5 years. Could you go help us understand what it means to actually deploy one of these? Why did NYU, for example, deploy a microgrid as opposed to just a backup generator? And could you help us understand how that deployment process goes?
Sure. So, I mean, we're a natural fit for a microgrid. We're about 14 million square feet in the city, about 135 buildings. Around Washington Square Park is where most of our density is. I don't have any franchise rights because I own the property usually on both sides of the street. So I just apply for revocable consent with the city and I can send utilities or power across the street. So in that sense, that's not an issue. Not to say I don't have other issues. We do.
What other issues?
Well, I'll get into those. But NYU has had a central heat, chill water, and electrical plant since the 70s. We had diesel generators, we had a steam boiler and a steam turbine. So we've had central utilities for a long time. The plant was getting older, and we looked at various iterations of what to do, one of which was, hey, our core value is educating students. Why are we in the power business? But when you really look at the efficiencies and the economics of a combined cycle power plant with our loads, okay, with our electrical loads and then with our thermal loads, it makes sense to do. So our new plant, repowered plant, expanded plant, we went from 7 buildings to 26 buildings, 7 megawatts to 13.4 megawatts, and it's been a successful 5-year run so far, so much so that we're now designing a 7 megawatt expansion to the plant.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and to set the stage for this regulatory conversation, this could be open to any one of you all. What are the biggest issues today, right now, regulatory-wise? Is it franchise rights, or what are the biggest barriers to having these projects actually being deployed when you do have conversations with potential owners of these systems?
Well, I'll take that one. I mean, franchise rights is certainly one piece of that, and I think through the REV proceeding, we're going to try to figure that out. I think we should be moving towards a new paradigm here in how the grid operates. From that sort of one-way delivery system to one that becomes a two-way system where a microgrid and distributed energy resources deployed at a customer site not only provides value to the customer themselves because they have greater reliability or resiliency, and additionally, they can provide services in an aggregated form, as Brett talked about, to the ISO. But there's the third value stream there, which is how they can assist the local grid operator. And lining up all those revenue streams is key to enabling the widespread deployment of microgrids today.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, do you think that microgrids should be charged the same standby rates as everyone else?
I think there is, a microgrid owner should pay a reasonable charge for the services they're receiving from the grid operator. But additionally, in exchange for that, they need an opportunity to receive payment for the services they're providing back to the grid. So I think we have to work out a two-way street where the value received and the value provided is fairly compensated.
And John, this might be something applicable to you. How hard is it to, I guess, negotiate those contracts with Con Ed or with a utility? Is it something that you guys have to work on a lot? Is it something that there are set guidelines for?
Is there anyone from Con Ed here?
Oh,
there you go. They're very easy to work with.
He's close to you, too.
No, I'll address. Thank you for being honest. Usually no hands go up, but they're here. I know they're here. They're everywhere. No, standby charges are a big issue, and I'm glad it's being addressed in REV, and that's positive. And I agree with your statement that the net result has to be a fair. The utilities are concerned about revenue protection during this changing landscape. For NYU, for a 13 megawatt microgrid, we pay over $11 million in standby charges. That's a lot of money. For us, we have a large scale, on-site, owned grid. For a smaller entity, that would be onerous. But if that's offset by frequency regulation and ancillary services and participating more in the grid, then it would be a fair exchange.
Are you talking about participating at the ISO level, or are you
Yes.
talking about, okay,
At the ISO level, right.
bypassing the utility, not through utility programs?
Well, we're all in this ecosystem together. So, the Con Ed interest in this is, not investing in infrastructure because there's a brand new state-of-the-art microgrid in Washington Square Village. And so that integrated long-term, short-term and long-term, short-term, medium and long-term planning is another symbiotic benefit of integrating that whole process. And I think that's also being addressed eventually in REV.
Paul, yeah, I mean...
So I think that New York is really taking a measured approach on this. I mean, many of us are familiar with what happened in Germany. They did an intensive PV push, and essentially what happened was they put so much PV out on the market that they built two electric systems, the electric delivery system and then the PV system. And as a result of that, rates rised. So utilities globally have looked at that and said, that's interesting. So what you hear in the utility chatter nationally is, how do we work with this? How do we basically defend against this? So nationally, what's happening is that utilities are looking at it and saying, okay, if you have a $20 a month fixed rate now, fixed charge now on your bill, and you pay an energy, part of it is energy, let's simply move that fixed charge to $100, and we'll charge less. And thereby we get our revenue back, and we get a guaranteed revenue stream. So what happens into that is that you lose completely the price signal or the participants like John that do what he's doing, because the fixed charge is so high. I think in New York what we're doing is we're looking at it and we're saying, we have a great delivery system providing safe and reliable power, and most people want that. But that delivery system is going to cost billions of dollars to upgrade and maintain over the next 10 years. And does it make sense to do that, or does it make more sense to look at the consumer side and invest something a lot less than that and build a much more reliable system, build a more resilient system, and at the same time create a market at the distribution level that's really a trading operation where the distribution company now is taking trades. They're taking trades from John. They're taking trades from the market coming down, and they're a market maker. And if there's many of us now are, we write software, we have hardware, those market players come in and they begin to optimize the electrical system. So really you have not a winner and a loser, but you have the winners. And I think you have to plan it well, and I think that's where we're headed.
But the argument from another stakeholder's perspective could be that the utility is still there serving the standby, providing the standby service. Do you think that we should still charge, the utility should still charge the same standby rate today? Or do you think a microgrid, for example, should be compensated for?
Well, I think that will be answered where we're going. But I can tell you that, and I think I can include John in this, that most larger institutions are not going to cut their wire back from their utility. And there's a value there. There's a value to that. I mean, you know, you have students, you have dormitories, you have a cold night, and you have a trip in your system. You want that distribution system there to back you up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that answer to that question, as we go through this, that will be answered. But it may not be a standby tariff. It may be something that we don't even know right now, something totally different. But almost an insurance policy that's there for these microgrid operators.
And as people plan these projects out, is this a topic that is often, I assume it is, but is this something you guys discuss often with utility executives? What should be that next rate?
That is where New York is going with reforming the energy vision. That discussion is where we're heading. It's a cataloging of where the system is weak, what upgrade dollars are needed there on a statewide basis, and then coming back to the stakeholders in the process and saying, okay, here's the distribution system, here's what we're going to spend to make it work for you. What can you do that would economize on that, number one, and number two, provide more resiliency. Much of, particularly in the southeast area, much of the resiliency came about as a result of Sandy. I mean, we all went through Sandy, and microgrids became, suddenly everybody was talking about a microgrid. Everybody was going to build a microgrid. So in theory, we should be able to have a more resilient electric system, a safe electric system, but when things like Sandy happen, you may have loss of power, and you may need a distribution company to come in and put the wires back up, get them off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But you won't have what we had last time.
Yeah, definitely. Right. So say that we do have this deployment of a number of microgrids in Manhattan and New York. To what extent does the utility have an operational jurisdiction in terms of, are they allowed to communicate with the point of common coupling, the PCC, to the grid? Where does it lie where you can say this is the utility's grid and then this is the third-party owner and operator? Anyone can
I'll
get to that.
Start on that one. So it's a very definite demarcation. It's in the breakers going from the plant back out to the grid. And so in our plant, very specific. Con Ed comes in when they need to take a breaker out. We have direct contact with both in telemetry and phones, and we have open communication. So they'll come in and do their maintenance. They have breakers that they maintain and operate and can operate in our plant, and then we have our internal breakers. So it's not a gray area. It's very definitive. And I think one of the big issues with microgrids and with cogen is, Con Ed's very concerned with protecting the grid and protecting their personnel working out on the grid. And so it's a real important issue, and it's a real issue. But I'd just like to say that I think Con Ed and the regulators in New York State, we have an ongoing dialogue on things like standby charges. And for NYU, we're connected with high tension service, 13,200 volts, centrally at the plant. And then in certain buildings, I'm also backed up with local service. And I'm paying standby charges on both high tension and low tension. Now, our opinion is that's unfair, but it's in the tariff. So there's an area for negotiation. We've brought it up to the regulator, we brought it up to Con Ed, and we're talking about it. So, I know REV is addressing that. I think there's currently a standby abatement for 4 years in there. It doesn't help me because we're not grandfathered, but that discussion is ongoing, and that's a good thing. When you do your financial pro forma, it's a real cost in going ahead with the investment.
Financing is a whole other subject, specifically third-party financing and how people are actually going to be, not dependent completely on state funding. But before I jump into that, say from an end user perspective, and this isn't utility microgrids, but if end users deploy more of these systems, should utilities adjust their procurement and resource adequacy considerations to accommodate microgrid development?
Well, I think it's happening today already, right? To the extent that customers are providing demand response and helping, clip the peak loads, that's affecting the overall resource adequacy requirements. So, I think it's happening, and I think it'll continue to happen when you think about a microgrid with a portfolio of distributed energy resources behind it. Battery storage, solar, combined heat and power. This mix of resources in and of itself is more resilient and less likely to go down completely and require, the full demand from the utility. So I think the reliance on the utility and the demand, sort of probability of taking the demand goes down, and so the charges should, reflect that.
Mm-hmm. So you're in favor of lower standby charges?
I
Okay.
think, it'll naturally, level out where it makes sense. But again, it's back to my point about, the value received
Yeah.
and the value.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty interesting perspective, and definitely one that's agreed upon from two angles, depending who you talk to. In terms of the number of value propositions you mentioned, demand response, you mentioned a few others, some of which do have a monetary value to it right now, some of which don't necessarily. How do you quantify how do you quantify resiliency on a microgrid? I'm sure NYU has a bunch of formulas that you'd say X hours of outages were actually could cost us so many dollars. How, in general, do you guys quantify a reliability for a microgrid?
Yeah. Well, the value of lost load is something that's been, people have struggled to quantify for many years, even in the historic grid operation, right? It's, what is the cost of an outage, business disruption, life and safety type issues. So, I think it comes down to, we work a lot with individual commercial customers, and for them, that value is different for every customer. Hospital customers, that value of resiliency is extremely high. There may be other customers that, they can accept a brief outage and they don't need sort of that, automatic transfer to islanded operation, but they just can't be down for days on end while, the ice melts and the lines are put back up. So they can accept some amount of outage, and, so for them, maybe a microgrid looks more like solar with battery storage. And so, for them, they can ride through a disturbance by powering just the most critical needs and not having to have 100% backup.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you guys have any other comments on that.
It's a difficult thing. I mean, how parents entrust us with their children in New York City. How do you put a price on during Sandy the fact that we had communications, telephone, and their child was in a lit, heated building instead of the madness that was, in downtown Manhattan with no lights. But there's other things like research and different things that you probably could put a price on, but ultimately it's pretty close to priceless.
Yeah, but as a public entity, you guys might be in a different case in terms of a CNI customer or an industrial plant. When you're looking to finance these things, and I don't know if you've been in conversations around this, but when a financier looks at this, they're looking for certainty, well, at least some degree of certainty and some degree of to qualify whatever cost, whatever investment is being made. How do financiers look at outages in terms of lost hours? Do they quantify it when you propose a microgrid to them? Is it something that they ask for or demand some sort of a monetary value for?
Well, I think we do finance a lot of our own work. And it's interesting, the question you asked, the prior question, because the microgrids that we have been involved with, the first question wasn't how can we save money? It was more along there's a need. Like, for instance, we put a plant in at Rikers Island, and there they had 80 standby generators that they needed to start when they lost power. And that's what started the conversation. The financing part of it is based, I would say, on two things. It's the creditworthiness of the person who's going to be holding the loan, and the risk of the project.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of the risk, and I think you guys would answer this better than I, although we have built them, is in the front end. It's the development risk of putting together the project and the unknown part of the interconnect to the utility, the air permitting, the environmental justice, that type of thing that can delay the start of initial power.
Mm-hmm.
And I would think that would probably be what would be on your guys' radar to a degree when you do your projects.
I think that's a great point. I do think it's one of the key challenges with microgrids is who will absorb that development risk.
Right.
But the technologies are maturing both on the hardware and software side, so they're coming together. So again, the physics of how you move the electrons around is kind of getting well understood. The hardware's there, the software's there. It is, though, there's a development risk challenge of who comes in and steps up. What I suspect NRG does what we do, although maybe we do on a slightly smaller scale than NRG. But we take on a lot of that development risk. We're willing to go out. We think we've got a good project. We'll absorb those risks, but they're not insignificant. And so I think there is a funding opportunity for firms who want to put capital work in this new type of infrastructure to maybe own the project over the long term, but also be on the front end to absorb some of that development risk.
So people watching, there probably are several developers out there that are looking at these projects right now. In terms of going to third-party capital providers, who is interested in actually deploying this, and what kind of ROI are they looking for or looking to get back? I mean, typically when you're investing in something, corporations, I think, just throwing out a number, would probably be looking at something like 13% return on their investment. What would microgrid, I mean, who are the third-party capital providers that would be interested in financing these solutions, and what kind of ROI would they be looking for?
Yeah, so I'll take a first cut at it. And
you don't have to be specific numbers.
And maybe Brad will chime in too. We're not finding any third-party financiers who are comfortable taking on the full capital stack of a microgrid. Each one we're finding is a little bit of a hodgepodge.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's a little grant money out there that covers a little bit of it. The customer themselves might be able to say, hey, we'll put a price on the resiliency we need, so we'll put a little bit in the project, and then the balance can be covered for the parts of the technology that are a little bit more bankable, and you get third-party financing. So we're finding that it needs a fair amount of creativity to put together that full capital stack. There's not one single source. It's companies like NRG, Timber Rock, taking some of that risk, putting some of our own sponsor equity in different pieces coming from different locations. So I back to, if somebody says they've got it all figured out, they're lying. It's somewhat similar. The financing side of this, each one is getting easier than the last, but to say it's all buttoned up, I would think would maybe be an exaggeration.
Yeah, I think they look at the underlying technologies, technology risk, and what are the revenue opportunities for those. But for the microgrid itself, I think it's still emerging. So I can't stress enough. I think the New York Rev, when it establishes a stable regulatory process that identifies the value streams and the revenue opportunities that a microgrid can provide, that's really where investors can look and say, well, how am I going to recover that investment? And I can see that there's the ISO markets, and now there are these other opportunities for the microgrid to fund itself.
Yeah, there's basically three things we can do with a microgrid. We can help the host site, we can help the ISO, and firms like ours are doing those two things. And then the third one is, how do you help the distribution system? And that's back to Rev. If we can quantify the value, we can actually provide back, whether it be VARs or power factor or other things we can deliver back. If we can quantify that, make that a known, that can get baked into project finance, that'll be huge. So I think that's we're missing that third leg of the stool, which I think will go a long way to help the project.
So you're saying that each component could be financed through a separate vehicle. Is it often that you go across maybe a solar PPA plus a different financing vehicle for a separate component? And then how is there like an umbrella vehicle that you could aggregate everything together, or is it individual people and individual contract terms that you have to negotiate for every component?
We've come up with some blanket microgrid as a service agreements, effectively an ESA, Energy Services Agreement, that's specific to a microgrid, where these different pieces can get plugged up into.
Interesting.
And I would say that's the finance piece. The operational piece is we really look at the microgrid at NYU as a local platform to build in all those renewables, to take demand response, to take what we're doing in energy conservation in the buildings and integrate that into the grid. So it's really that gateway to the grid. And so we're doing a lot of work in making our buildings smart, things like LED lights, LED lighting control. And then how do you monetize that and sell that back into the capacity market?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the LED and the efficiency, because obviously a lot of building owners are making their buildings more efficient.
Right.
But we go in when we talk to folks to say, yes, that LED might have a 2-year payback, but borrow a little bit of those savings to put in some of the additional sophistication to get you to a microgrid down the road. So really, efficiency is as much a part of the microgrid as everything else. Just don't go for the short, quick satisfaction of the LED retrofit. Make that comprehensive part of your comprehensive microgrid strategy. And then there's LEDs and there's efficiency. You actually throw out some cash that can help subsidize the harder stuff.
And the technology is great, and it's pretty stable. Whether it's LEDs or turbines or recip engines, it's really the brains and how you integrate that, whether it's a 1 building or a 100 building microgrid. And so that's the next frontier, I think, economic dispatch of all those assets for the benefit of the end user and for the benefit of the grid.
This might be jumping onto another subject, but another thing that's often interesting, and since we do have one person in the audience from a utility, it could be interesting to address that. Should microgrids that enhance resiliency of critical facilities be rate-based, especially if they serve a local community? If anyone has an opinion on that.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't see that why there's any reason that they inherently need to be rate-based. Competitive providers like NRG are capable of going out and working with customers to tailor a solution to their needs, and innovating and providing value. And I think that's, ideally, I think that's the direction that it should be going. That if we want to encourage the widespread deployment of microgrids, that we want to, have innovators come in and work with customers and provide services and attract private capital, then I think having fostering the competitive market as the first opportunity is really key.
And do you think it makes, and I don't know if it makes sense today, and I don't think many utilities are doing this, but on the community side of things, especially when you talk about resiliency, do you see a future where utilities will actually taking on microgrids and deploying them themselves? And this is the regulated part of a utility when it has to do with resiliency-oriented projects.
I think that issue is being explored here in New York. I think privately owned microgrids can serve that resiliency service. So the way I would see it is, the utility identifies a need and they say, I need this type of service in this area for, enhancement and support of my distribution system. And, if there's a way for any competitive provider to come in and work with a customer and provide that service in that area, they will.
I agree. I think that inherently, microgrids and cogen plants are small entities in the big scheme of things, in the nuclear plant and the commercial power plant. I think the utilities running the T&D and competitive companies innovating and building out small microgrids is a good model.
But Paul, I'd like to circle back to the point Paul was making earlier in explaining the REV proceedings and the sort of the vision of allowing the utilities to be a distribution system operator, where they're operating a marketplace or a network, and where they're incented for having as many transactions going across that network as possible. And if that sounds a little bit like telecom, it should, because we've seen this movie before. That's happened over the last 20 years, and really opened up the marketplace. So we're talking about our cell phones. All the great services we get now was because the network changed and how people could get on the network changed. And the people who owned the wires were incented differently. Rather than saying, hey, if you're putting something on the network, you're taking away from something from me. The system operator can take a little toll for all these transactions. So as transactions go up, the utility can benefit. So that's really why it's important that fundamentally, although it's easy, we tend to think about things, well, should utilities build microgrids, and if so, should they rate base them? That's sort of the way we've historically thought about things. In future, if we can get to a point where the utility is managing a network, incented and benefits from more transactions on that network, that's really what will open up innovation and really change things. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win, if I can use that overused term.
Here's a question for you. Say a third-party provider, a competitive third-party provider, deploys a microgrid. Take Roosevelt Island here in New York.
Yeah.
And say that they buy the underlying distribution grid, and that means Con Ed, the customers are no longer Con Ed customers. Is Con Ed responsible, would Con Ed be responsible for delivering power to the point of common coupling where the microgrid starts, or would they be responsible for providing reliability to the actual underlying customers? Who takes on that risk?
Well, in the state of New York, there are municipally owned power systems. And typically, the distribution company will tie to the substation of that municipal distribution company, and then on the other end of that tie, the municipality will take over and run their own system, and they're responsible for it, and they transact that, all of the business. The meters, everything, or the municipality. So in that case, I would imagine that Con Ed would, in this case, Con Ed would deliver the power to the substation where the Roosevelt municipal system took over, and then they would take it from there. But I wanted to go back a little bit. We are talking about like tariffs and standby charges and things like that. But maybe to change the thinking, think of your cell phone. When cell phones first came out, and you got your first bill, your bill was this thick because it had every text you sent, who you sent it to, what time you sent it, who sent you a text, what time you made a phone call, how long your phone call was, and all that stuff was in your bill. And your bill was literally for a family of 4 like this. And now they don't do that. That data does not exist on the electric side right now, but that's where we're going. So that's where we're headed. If we're all residential customers, I live up in Orange County. My utility knows my electrical use at my house every 2 or 3 months because I'm estimated for the rest of the time. Not long from now, they'll know every minute what my electrical use is, and they'll know what everybody else's is and when it's used and who's using it. And that's the transactional market that we'll set up, and that's what's going to change it.
So you bring up, this whole notion of, it's an interesting notion, and it could easily be tied back when we're talking about billing to this Roosevelt municipality. Say that there is a new microgrid deployed over there. Would they, out of curiosity, be subject to the same billing regulatory PUC regulation? Who would be in charge of essentially the quality of power within a third-party owned microgrid?
In some cases, in New York State,
Yeah.
in some cases, those municipal systems are regulated by the New York State Public Service Commission, and sometimes they're regulated by the New York Power Authority, depending on the system. But they do follow the basic guidelines that the larger investor-owned utilities follow.
And in the case of my microgrid, I'm responsible for it. So.
Where NRG is a provider of that service to a customer. We have agreements and service quality metrics that we need to meet.
Okay. A couple of other interesting points that could be interesting to touch on. So under the current regulatory regime right now, do you foresee a point where, and I don't know if we touched on this completely, do you foresee a point when utilities will be deploying these things? And if so, is that something you see in the next 3-5 years when you actually see utility-owned and operated microgrids? Maybe not the generation assets, but the wires. And I know this could play into the whole REV situation where you do have transactions and data being exchanged everywhere. But how would a utility microgrid compare to an end-user owned and operated microgrid with its interaction with the grid? I mean, it would be the utilities grid, but how would it compare?
Well, we don't have one electricity market in the U.S. We have 50, of course. Each state's regulated differently. So we're going to see a lot of experimentation. So I will make a very bold prediction and say, yes, we will see utility-owned microgrids somewhere. We're going to see all. Imagine a flavor. You're going to see it because different states are going to try different regulatory bodies are going to try different ways of deploying these, and I think we're also going to see different ways of paying for them, rate basing in other ways. So I think we're going to see a lot of experimentation, which will be a good thing. I think though fundamentally, if we move forward and utilities start building and owning microgrids, and the basic underpinnings or the basic alignment of interests doesn't change from what we've been talking about, I think it's going to be challenging. I mean, I think we do have to sort of at a structural level move more toward this distribution system operator, this network approach. If I think that happens, it's good for the utilities, it's good for the third parties. If we try to just jam utility-owned microgrids into the existing regulatory structure and rate base it, I think we won't be addressing really the real opportunity to kind of really overhaul the whole system.
Do you think outside of New York that there's a high incentive for utility to maybe operate or have some sort of operational jurisdiction over the generation assets of a microgrid while the microgrid is its own separate entity?
I don't know.
I'm not sure.
I don't. First of all, I'll take the opposite approach, but I don't see utilities, at least in the New York state market. I mean, my personal opinion, I don't.
Yeah. Well, New York
I
is
think
tough. There's regulatory.
There's so much redesign going on, which is a good thing. And I
Yeah.
came out of the utility business. That was my first career before NYU. So I'm familiar with the model, but I don't see utilities the regulated business of utilities. Maybe the non-regulated businesses will get into it. I also don't see them disaggregating generation from distribution. I think that a microgrid is the generation and the distribution in a local area. So I might be wrong. They may split that, and maybe the unregulated or regulated utility businesses will take over private microgrids. And maybe an owner would run the generation and they would run the T&D. I don't know.
Well, it definitely is a very interesting landscape to look forward to, and there's a lot of regulatory change right now that might create different incentives, and not only at the PUC level, but also at the ISO level, where you have market redesign in California and elsewhere. Brent, in terms of participating at the ISO level, where do you see, and I know you're active in PJM, do you see opportunities elsewhere? And there's, for example, like aggregation under the DERP proposals in California. Do you foresee that being a major driver for microgrids to participate in wholesale markets, or is that strictly separate DG participating in the wholesale?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work in PJM, so just south of where we're at now, because as far as in ISO, that market is mature, fluid, a lot of small nameplate, small systems can get into the market. So for us, that's really great. A lot of small building level stuff can get in and be participant in these revenue streams with the ISO. What's going on in California is very interesting. We're getting more clarity now on what the clearing prices for some of these aggregated systems are going to be. So I would say, just from our point of view, PJM probably the most interesting, most mature market for small building level microgrids to get in and get some of these ancillary services revenue opportunity. California, very interesting, clearly, but what's going on here in New York State with REV, I think we'll open that up as well. So I'd say probably PJM, Cal ISO, New York are areas where I think the sort of ISO market participations are going to be most interesting over the next few years.
Okay, I think we've got about 5 more minutes left, and I wanted to take a quick opportunity to ask you guys, as sort of pseudo closing statements, to really paint us a picture of where you see New York's microgrid market in the next 5 years, post New York Prize. Are we going to have Manhattan segmented into a bunch of different microgrids, or is Con Ed going to be, or is the utility going to be involved, or how is it going to look like upstate and remote communities? I mean, feel free to be as creative as you want. But if we wanted to go down the line as your closing statements to address like where you see microgrids in 5 years in New York.
Sure. Well, I mean, certainly the utilities are going to be involved. I think what I see is us reaching a regulatory status here in New York where there's a robust competitive environment for different providers of microgrid services and distributed energy resources to go out and put those together and provide value to the customer directly, provide it to the distribution grid, and provide it to the wholesale market operator. And then I see the role of the utility being a disinterested party when it comes to the microgrid and the DERs, but being the facilitator and an enabler of the markets that define the value for those resources, and and in addition, having a rate structure that encourages utilities to invest in make prudent investments in their distribution system that are enabler of the two-way grid, and I think that's where we're going.
Paul, I'm sure you'd agree to most of those points.
Yeah, I think that over the next 5 years, you're going to see the electric system make a lot more use of data collection and control systems that are common in other industries, but not so common in the electric business. I think that the Internet of Things is going to explode in the electric side. You're just going to see a lot of communication back and forth between the distribution company and devices that are on the grid, both on the customer side of the meter and on the utility side of the meter. I think you're going to see a lot of speed in movement of data and communication. And I think what's going to happen with that is we couple that with the reducing costs of renewable energy, clean energy, and particularly the density and cost of storage, that you're going to see a major shift from large power plants, transmission upgrade, customer use, back the other way, and transactional exchange happening in the market. And I don't think we're far off.
And do you think that, I see how it would directly apply to things like microgrids, but do you feel like, again, in New York in 5 years, would that directly create more of an environment where microgrids might be a ripe environment for microgrids to be deployed?
Absolutely. Yeah, that will be one of the basic building blocks of that. The resiliency of the system will be much higher than it is now.
Mm-hmm. Brent?
Yeah, I think Paul's on fire tonight to bring up the Internet of Things is very germane. We think about microgrids as sort of supply-side resources, generators, batteries, solar panels, CHP. We talked a little bit about load, efficient load, but all these are going to be interconnected with all these devices will be smart and interconnected. So these microgrids are going to be both supply side and demand side is going to be really tightly integrated in a way we haven't seen before, and a granularity we haven't seen before, which is going to really open things up in an exciting way. I think the main thing we're going to see is just more flavors of microgrids, more variations on the microgrid theme. Certainly a lot of what I'll call the more classic multi-megawatt campus-wide microgrids, but I think we're going to start seeing building-scale microgrids popping up where it lives behind a meter, it skirts a lot of the regulatory concerns, but heck, it's a microgrid, it can island, it can deliver services back, and you're going to look around, they're going to be, I think, popping up, but then they can still be aggregated in mass. So I think we're going to see a little bit more sort of bottoms-up, small microgrids popping up all over the place, and I think we're going to, I think that'll be very exciting.
Okay.
So will utilities and the ISO be involved and be important 5 years or 10 years from now? Absolutely. They'll always have an important role. It might be a different role, but they'll always have an important role. I couldn't agree more with big data. And it's happening right now. We have a project in Brooklyn, the Center for Urban Science and Progress, CUSP, and we're gut renovating a building, and we're putting ice storage, microturbines, solar, and a very robust and sophisticated building management system, and we're measuring everything, and it's going to be a living lab. Okay, and that big data and what you do with that data and how you run New York City and other large urban cities more efficiently with all that data is really the key. The brains and that sophisticated algorithms that are going to run things. And I think the big data is really going to point people, whether it's a bigger hospital or university campus or single building cogens, it's going to point people towards on-site generation. It really is. And I'm very hopeful with REV and with the technology that's exploding right now that, 5 and 10 years from now, New York City will be a network of microgrids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think, the vision that we're driving towards is, someday when the next Superstorm Sandy comes along and the grid goes down, maybe nobody notices because the NYU system and the system at another hospital and another university picked up the load, and the battery storage in every homeowner's apartment building also picked up, and the lights stayed on. And I think that's where we're going to get to someday.
Great. All right, well, I think that brings us to the end of the show tonight. I think the panelists are probably going to stick around for a little bit, I think, for a couple beers. If you guys have any questions for them, feel free to come up. But please join me in giving them a round of applause.